Wait, are you that kid? From the beach?
The beach?
So the premiere of Cloak and Dagger, that was pretty decent actually. I mean, it was not as good as I wanted it to be, but it was surprisingly way better than I expected it to be. I know, for some people it was just the best thing ever, and for some others it was the worst thing ever, and I cannot please everyone, but I need to tell you that when evaluating a series like Cloak and Dagger, something that airs on Freeform, you gotta factor in certain things. You don't compare it to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., plainly Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., or you don't compare it to Legion or The Gifted. This series is not really aimed at every single person out there, at every single viewer of comic book TV series and comic book movies. Instead, it is aimed at attracting certain groups of audiences. For one, you've got the young adults and teenagers, ones that were not even attracted to series like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or series like Legion, not all of them at least. But then you've got two, comic book lovers in general, because these are gonna watch these kind of series regardless. Comic book readers, these people are gonna watch any series. You give them Inhumans with how bad it was, with how bad they hated it, and they're gonna watch it anyway. That is exactly what happened with me over there. But finally, number 3, kids with a crush on Olivia Holt, because I'm sure, unlike me, not everyone actually went, who in the hell is Olivia Holt, when they first heard her name 2 to 3 months ago. She's a Disney star, a lot of people know her. I didn't. A lot of people my age probably didn't as well, but she is very big in certain circles. But hopefully though, considering these kind of factors, does explain to you why this one is not going to be your typical Marvel superhero TV series. With that being said, and without further ado, welcome back guys, let's go. So number 1. First of all, one thing that we should not expect hearing on the series is the word mutant, neither in conjunction with Tyrone nor in conjunction with Tandy. Now I've read many varying opinions on the topic as of recently, and to cut a long story short, originally they were considered mutants in the comics, but you've also got to remember that this was kind of retconned, so they ended up being mutates in the comics rather than mutant, and this was all a product of the tests run on them by Dr. Nemesis, and he ended up with the conclusion that they got their powers as a product of the drug injected into them rather than through some genetic mutation. So as opposed to certain mutants in the comics having their powers awakened through being exposed to certain stimuli, like the cases with Polaris for example, the drug Cloak and Dagger have been exposed to in the comics and wherever they have been exposed to on last night's episode. Those two aren't really stimuli, but rather root causes, sources of the powers that these two have gotten. But number 2, so right off the bat and on the premiere, we're getting multiple comic book Easter eggs and patterns that are resemblant of comic book Easter eggs. So we're not only talking Easter eggs, but we're talking Easter eggs in the form of parallels to the comic book story, because the story has been changed for the series. So for one thing, we get to see Nathan Tyler, Tandy's father, who's also known in the comics as the Lord of Light, making her other alias besides Dagger, Lady Light. Very, very fitting. Now the background story for Tandy over here and her father have been significantly changed from the comics. So the father in the comics never really worked for Roxxon. He did not really die the way he did on the premiere. He did not die at all to start with. Instead, the man actually was divorced from her mother and moved to live in India in pursuit of spiritual guidance. Now while this happens to be one of those severe comic book deviations that I was talking about earlier, it is still a huge parallel to the comics. It still does help form this halo of abandonment issues around Tandy. She's still got the same problems she's got in the comics, the very same problems that got her to run away from her mother's house, both here on the series and back in the comics. But on the subject of Tandy's mother as well did deviate by a whole lot from the comics. She's not the supermodel she is in the comics. She did not get the money of her father in the divorce, and she did not marry another man, even though the boyfriend is as close as it gets to that part. But once again, the status of her mother, that boyfriend, the whole 9 yards, pretty much all of it just builds up towards Tandy feeling abandoned by her parents. One is dead and the other one is just not there. She's never really there. But number 4, since we got to speaking about Tandy's father and him working for Roxxon, Roxxon is by far the biggest tie-in to the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that we got to see in last night's episode. But that's not just it, Roxxon is as well a huge comic book Easter egg. So just like the cases within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Roxxon is pretty shady in the comics. Now even though Roxxon had strong ties with S.H.I.E.L.D., they even funded them at one point, they had secret ties with Hydra as well. Interestingly enough though, and for the sake of trivia, this was uncovered in the comics or on the pages of the comics for the very first time ever by Rick Stoner, the very first director of S.H.I.E.L.D. I'm sure a lot of you remember Rick Stoner. Yes, he's that funny guy from all those fun video messages in the present day Lighthouse on Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 5. But stepping away from the comic book Easter egg that Roxxon is, a wealth of information by the way that could fill an entire video on its own, number 5, Roxxon in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is huge as well. The organization, as well as other affiliated organizations, has played a shady role within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with appearances ranging from simple cameos of the company's billboards to full-on integration, and all in 5 series so far, Cloak Dagger included, a Marvel one-shot, and each and every one of the 3 Iron Man movies. But anyway, and as of the airing of the premiere, it is pretty obvious that the chances are pretty high that the villains of the season happen to be Roxxon and employees and managers within Roxxon. Number 6, yet another parallel and another Easter egg. We've got the wrongly accused best friend of Tyrone, Billy, gunned down before Tyrone's eyes, only the series made him into Tyrone's older brother and also changed the timeline, having the events go down in advance rather than when Tyrone was around 17 years of age. Number 7, we've got our variation of the accident that made our superheroes into what they are. So instead of the drug used on them by Simon Marshall in the comics, it was their close-to-death encounter with drowning after the storm started and the explosion of what seemed to be a Roxxon refinery. Now just like the shooting of Billy happened at a younger age when it comes to Tyrone, and when compared to the comics, this as well did happen at a younger age when it comes to both Tyrone and Tandy. So in the comics, this happened to both of them when they were both around 17. Our Cloak and Dagger over here got abducted together and injected by the drug that gave them their powers, but only post Tandy making her runaway move away from her mother, and post Tyrone watching Billy gunned down by the cops and right before his eyes. But all of that does bring us to number 8, so Dagger's got a drug problem, or at least she does seem to have a drug problem, and we do see that clearly on the premiere. Now, I do think that happens to be a parallel to the MAGGIA or MAGGIA drug, not sure how it is pronounced, but that is the drug that Simon Marshall used on both her and Tyrone, the drug that gave them their powers. But number 9, that kid Liam that Tandy is running with over the course of the show's premiere, he does seem to be the replacement for Rob Daltrey from the comics. Now Rob in the comics is Tandy's teenage boyfriend, the one whose departure has her on a bus and heading for NYC, where she would end up meeting up with Tyrone, abducted by Simon Marshall, injected by the drug, and gaining her powers as Dagger. Number 10, the big Roxxon Corp sign that Tyrone wakes up next to the morning after his powers were activated is not only one more Easter egg to comic book and Marvel Cinematic Universe Roxxon, but possibly the strongest hint so far as to who the villain of the season is. I mean, the signs do get stronger when we get the many name drops of Roxxon throughout the episode. We've got the problems that Tandy and her mother has got with Roxxon, we've got Tyrone's mother dropping the name, we've got Tandy's mother repeatedly dropping the name, we've got all the billboards, we've got all the mentions. It's like crazy when it comes to Roxxon. But however, the reason I'm mentioning this bit is not really to talk about Roxxon, but rather to talk about Tyrone and his abilities. So what happens both over there and when he wakes up in the trunk of that cop's car? That's all about his Darkforce teleportation ability from the comics. Now what happens over here is Tyrone could basically teleport by entering the Darkforce dimension. He travels a small distance in there, and then he leaves at a huge distance further away from where he first started on Earth. But number 11, this kind of interdimensional travel is a direct reference and Easter egg to the dimensional travel we did see on both Doctor Strange as well as the interdimensional travel on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. done by none other than the Ghost writer Robbie Reyes. The only difference over here is that over there, they've both got to create portals in order to go in and out of these dimensions. But over here, and on the other hand, Tyrone in and out of himself is a conduit to the Darkforce dimension. He is, or his body is, the portal itself to the Darkforce dimension. But number 12, since we keep mentioning the Darkforce and the Darkforce dimension, let's not forget that the Darkforce was very, very big when it comes to Agent Carter, Season 2 of Agent Carter in specific. Let's as well not forget the connection between the Darkforce dimension and the Darkhold, which is pretty much an integral part of the 4th season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Number 13, throughout this episode, we get to see Tyrone channeling the Darkforce, and repeatedly, so we pretty much get to watch him create these prototype fields of darkness. Now this ability is much bigger in the comics and I'm expecting it to be much bigger on the series, so I'm expecting we're going to be seeing these fields of darkness in greater magnitude and in greater effect as well, but as episodes pass by. Number 14, the cop from Tyrone's childhood, the one who shot Billy, our crooked cop with a badge in his car. That gives us two villains this season so far, or seemingly two villains. We've got the Cop and we've got Roxxon. Now from what I know, this season is going to have a 10-episode run, and correct me if I'm wrong over here, and it will have to deal with two villains at the very least, because the Cop is not really the big bad of the season. We think the other big bad is Roxxon. We cannot be sure or 100% sure, but it does seem so far that this is the case. So the problem over here is, or the question, the major question, is how will the season deal with these two villains when one of them needs an entire season on its own? One of them is so huge, you would be barely able to deal with them on a 10-episode season, let alone on part of a 10-episode season. So while I'm still under the assumption that Roxxon is going to play a major role on the season and be the major villain of the season, I don't think they're going to resolve the Roxxon issue by the end of the season. You can't just defeat a corporation like Roxxon by the end of a 10-episode season. But they definitely could, and I think they would merge both endgames in a way, have the Cop on the payroll of none other than Roxxon. Number 15, Tandy's abilities to create light daggers. I think this was one of the highlights of the episode for me. I mean, that was her first light dagger. She uses it against Rick when Rick attacks her. Now, I don't really want to prolong the comic book explainer parts, but the creation and the use of the life force daggers happens to be the main ability of Tandy. She could create them given certain circumstances, like for example, her being in danger or someone else close to her being in danger. Now the problem with the light force daggers is the further away they go from her, the weaker they get, the weaker their abilities get. The light force daggers could obviously be used to drain life out of her enemy to the point where she could kill them, yet she usually uses them to send her enemies into shock in the comics. That's exactly what she did as well on last night's episode, yes, inadvertently, but it was an Easter egg to her performance in the comics. Number 16, this one is less of an Easter egg, but I gotta say, I enjoyed the bit with the silent Cop. The way she did not say a single word for the majority of her appearance on the episode until that moment where she arrested Liam, of course, close to the end, that was really good. That was really funny, because every time she came on screen, I was waiting for her to say something, expecting her to say something, but then the scene ended up being over with not a word to show for it. Definitely loved that touch on this episode. Number 17, loved how Tyrone's abilities do not work when he needs them, but they do work whenever he doesn't need them. They obviously put him in shit situations, including that one at the very end where he ended up shooting on Tandy rather than the Cop who killed his brother. But in all cases, the way he ends up right in front of Tandy, obviously the trailers were not lying. So far, something is indeed pushing them together, and we're waiting for that one thing or those many things that are gonna pull them apart. Now before I end this video, let me say this. Now this series has gotten this Runaways feel to it, even though the premiere of Runaways in my opinion was way better than this one. Not way better, but decently better. But in all cases, I've got this feeling I could see it happening one day, this series crossing over with Runaways, just like they did in the comics, and I think it's gonna happen sooner than later. But I could definitely see improvement in the cards for this one. It is definitely way better than Inhumans so far. The acting is better than I expected, not as great as I would have hoped. It does try to be fast-paced, but it is not consistent all the time. It is slow-paced at times, but it is all understandable as well. It is still in that phase where it is trying to establish all these characters while struggling with it, and honestly, that just happens with a lot of series on their premieres. With that being said though, let me know in the comments what you thought of the premiere of Cloak and Dagger. Let me know who you think the major villain of the season is, and if you agree with me that Roxxon is gonna be the major villain of the season. Let me know what you thought of their abilities, the CG used for their abilities, and let me know if you did like this video by dropping it a much appreciated like, and if that were to be the case, you could always subscribe and enable notifications for my future videos, community posts, and live streams. Until my next video that you tune in for though, thank you all for tuning in, and have a great day.